on the morning she turned 32. Lydia Staverton stopped counting the years she had left. The decision arrived without ceremony, somewhere between her second cup of weak tea and the sound of her sister's laughter drifting up from the parlour below. It was not grief that settled over her. It was arithmetic. 32 years of waiting had produced exactly nothing, and she was tired of carrying the sum. She was sitting in the small room at the back of her brother-in-law's townhouse in Mayfair, the room everyone called hers, but which belonged, like everything else in her life, to someone else. The wallpaper was faded roses. The window looked out onto a narrow courtyard where the servants hung laundry on Tuesdays. It was not an unhappy room. It was simply not a room that had ever been chosen. From downstairs, she heard her sister Honoria's bright, carrying voice. "Of course we keep her. What else would we do? She is marvelous with the children, and Clement says she costs less than a governess." One must be practical about these things. Lydia set her teacup down on the saucer with great care. She had excellent hearing. Honoria had never understood this, or perhaps she simply did not care. Poor Lydia, Honoria continued to whoever was visiting that morning. She had her chances, you know. There was a curate once, years ago, but father would not hear of it. And then father died, and the money was gone. And well, here she is, 32, and still useful, which is more than one can say for most women in her position. Useful. The word sat in Lydia's chest like a stone. She was useful the way a good umbrella was useful, appreciated in foul weather, forgotten in fair, and never once considered beautiful. She rose from her chair and went to the mirror above the small writing desk. The face that looked back at her was not plain, not exactly. She had good bones, her mother's dark brows, clear grey-green eyes that people sometimes called striking when they were being kind, but she wore no ornament, no colour. Her hair was pinned in a style that had not been fashionable in 5 years. She looked like what she was, a woman who had stopped expecting to be looked at. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. "Enough," she said quietly, and meant it. That same week, Honoria insisted she attend Lord Bridgeford's spring ball. "You cannot stay in your room like some medieval anchoress, Lydia. People will think we mistreat you. You must be seen. You must smile. You must at least pretend." Pretend? Lydia had been pretending for a decade. She wore a gown of dark sage green, a colour that made her feel like part of the scenery, which was precisely her intention. In the ballroom, she found a quiet alcove near the terrace doors and settled in to watch. She had always been good at watching. It was the one skill her life had honed to perfection. The room was the usual spectacle. Mothers manoeuvring daughters into the paths of eligible men, young officers laughing too loudly, debutantes in white muslin moving like swans across the polished floor. Lydia observed it all with the detached appreciation of someone watching a play she had seen too many times. The plot never changed. Only the cast was different. She noticed him because he was the only other person in the room who was not performing. Rhys Colburn, the Duke of Ashenmere, stood near a marble pillar with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned to endure public spaces the way one endures a cold rain, by refusing to acknowledge it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in unrelieved black. His dark hair was cut short, almost severe. His face was all angles, a sharp jaw, a straight nose, deep-set, eyes that appeared nearly black in the candlelight. He was not handsome in the way fashion demanded. He was striking the way a cliff face is striking, forbidding, weathered, and utterly indifferent to opinion. They called him the Iron Duke, though not to his face. He had held the title for 7 years, during which time he had refused every introduction, declined every invitation to dance, and retreated so completely from society that his rare appearances had become a source of fevered speculation. Some said he was mad, others said he was mourning. The general consensus was that he was simply cold, a man whose heart had calcified long ago into something hard and unreachable. Lydia watched as a determined mama in lavender silk steered her trembling daughter toward him. The Duke inclined his head, murmured something brief and final, and the pair withdrew as though they had touched a hot stove. He did this twice more, his face never changing, his courtesy never faltering, his disinterest never in question. She felt an unexpected flicker of recognition, not attraction. She was long past such foolishness. But kinship. He was alone in a crowded room, so was she. The only difference was that his solitude was a fortress. Hers was a sentence. She was reaching for a glass of lemonade from a passing tray when she looked up and found his eyes on her. He was not glancing. He was looking. His gaze was steady and assessing, the way one might study an unexpected feature in a landscape. A tree growing from bare rock, perhaps, something that had no business being there and yet clearly was. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than propriety allowed, and 1 second longer than courage should have permitted. Then she looked away, her pulse doing something strange and unfamiliar in her throat. When she looked back, he had turned away. The moment was over. She told herself it meant nothing. She was very nearly right. 4 days later, Clement Firth came to her in the morning room with a look on his face that suggested the world had tipped sideways and he was trying to maintain his balance. Clement was a man built for steadiness, a solicitor by profession, reliable, unimaginative, and perpetually bewildered by anything outside the scope of property law. "Lydia," he said, and then stopped. He tried again. "Lydia, the Duke of Ashenmere is in my study." She looked up from the children's geography primer she had been reviewing. "I beg your pardon, he is in my study," Clement repeated, as though saying it a second time might make it more plausible. "He wishes to speak with you. He has made an offer of marriage. To you." The silence that followed was so complete that Lydia could hear the mantel clock in the next room. "That is not possible," she said. "I am aware," Clement replied. She smoothed her morning dress, checked that her hair was reasonably in order, and followed him downstairs. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. The Duke of Ashenmere filled Clement's modest study, the way a thunderstorm fills a valley. He rose when she entered, and the sheer height of him was disorienting. In daylight she could see what candlelight had concealed. The faint lines of strain at the corners of his eyes, the tight set of his mouth, the rigid discipline in every line of his body. This was a man held together by will alone. "Miss Staverton," he said. His voice was low and precisely controlled, like an instrument tuned too tightly. "Your Grace." He gestured to a chair. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then sat as well, as though the act of being at the same level as another person required a conscious decision. "I will not waste your time," he said. "I am in need of a wife, not a companion for social occasions, not a decoration for my table, not a broodmare for the succession. I need a woman of intelligence and composure who can manage a household that has been neglected, and who will not require me to be something I am not." Each sentence was delivered like a clause in a contract, which, Lydia realized, was exactly what it was. "I observed you at Lord Bridgeford's ball," he continued. "You were the only person in that room who appeared to be genuinely at ease with solitude. That is a quality I value above all others." Clement was making small distressed noises by the fireplace. "Your Grace, I must point out, Lydia is 32. She has no dowry to speak of. Her family's circumstances are, well, reduced." The Duke's gaze did not leave Lydia's face. "I am aware of Miss Staverton's age and circumstances. They are irrelevant to my decision." Lydia studied him. She had spent a decade reading people from the margins, and she read him now with the full force of that hard-won skill. He was not cruel. He was not mad. He was something far more complicated. He was a man in tremendous pain who had convinced himself he was merely practical. "Why me?" she asked. Truly, he was quiet for a long moment. "Because when I looked at you," he said, "you were not pretending. Every other person in that ballroom was wearing a mask. You had simply stopped. And I found I could not look away from someone who had stopped pretending." It was the most honest thing a man had ever said to her. It was also, she suspected, the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. She thought of her faded room. She thought of Honoria's voice carrying up the stairs. She thought of the decades ahead, the children growing up and needing her less, Clement politely suggesting perhaps she might take a position somewhere, the slow narrowing of her world until she occupied no space at all. The Duke was offering her a transaction, but within the terms of that transaction was something she had not possessed in 13 years, a door she could walk through. "I accept," she said. Honoria's reaction was a performance worthy of Drury Lane. She wept, she raged, she clutched at Lydia's hands and swore she would never allow it. "He is a monster, Lydia, a recluse. You will be buried alive in that God-forsaken estate of his, and no one will ever hear from you again." What Lydia heard beneath the concern was calculation. If Lydia left, Honoria would lose her unpaid governess, her seamstress, her flower arranger, her convenient saint. She would lose the person against whom she measured her own good fortune. "I have accepted," Lydia said. "The matter is settled." "Then you are a fool," Honoria snapped, and left the room. They were married quietly in a Mayfair church on a Tuesday morning. Honoria did not attend. Clement stood as witness, perspiring lightly with anxiety. The Duke spoke his vows in a voice so controlled it might have been reciting a legal document. Lydia spoke hers clearly, looking at the man she was binding herself to, and wondering, with the peculiar calm of someone stepping off a cliff, what lay at the bottom. The journey north to Thorn Hollow took 2 days by carriage. They spoke perhaps 40 words between them during those 2 days, and 30 of them concerned the weather or the state of the roads. He sat opposite her, reading dispatches, his long legs folded at an angle in the confined space. She watched the landscape change through the carriage window. The neat hedgerows of the south, giving way to open moorland, the sky widening, until it felt like the whole world was made of nothing but grey sky and dark heather. It was a country that did not bother with charm. It simply was. Thorn Hollow appeared at the end of a mile-long drive lined with ancient elms. It was a house of dark stone, sprawling and severe, built into the side of a hill, as though it had been arguing with the landscape for centuries, and neither had won. It was not beautiful, it was magnificent. Smoke rose from a single chimney. The rest of the windows were dark. A line of servants stood on the front steps, silent and rigid. At their head was a housekeeper named Mrs. Burnett, whose face conveyed the warmth of a granite headstone. Beside her, a butler whose name was Draycott, and whose bow was so deep it bordered on reproach. "Your Grace," Mrs. Burnett said, her gaze travelling over Lydia's simple travelling dress, with the precision of a customs inspector. "Welcome to Thorn Hollow." The Duke led her inside and promptly disappeared into his study, leaving her standing in the great hall with 60 feet of vaulted ceiling above her and the distant sound of a door closing somewhere in the depths of the house. That first week was the loneliest of her life, lonelier than the room at Honoria's, because at Honoria's she had at least been lonely in company. Here, the loneliness was architectural. It lived in the empty corridors, in the shut-up rooms draped in white linen, in the dining hall where a table for 2 was set at one end of a room designed for 60. She saw the Duke only at dinner, where they ate in a silence so oppressive that the scrape of a knife against porcelain sounded like a shout. He was fulfilling his contract. He had given her a title, a home, and an allowance more generous than anything she had ever imagined. He clearly considered the transaction complete. On the 5th night, Lydia asked Mrs. Burnett to move dinner to the small morning room at the back of the house. It had wide windows, a fireplace that actually warmed the space, and room for only a small round table. When the Duke arrived for dinner and found himself in the morning room instead of the cavern, he paused in the doorway. His eyes moved from the crackling fire to the intimate table to Lydia, who stood with her hands clasped, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. "I hope you don't mind," she said. The dining hall felt rather like eating inside a cathedral. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the faintest crack in the granite. "I do not mind," he said and sat down. It was the first change. There would be others, each one small, each one hard-won. She found the library on her 7th day, a vast 2-story room choked with dust and neglect. Books had been left open on tables, spines cracking. A magnificent globe stood in one corner. Its oceans faded to grey. She began to set it right, one shelf at a time, without asking permission. It gave her something to do with her hands, while her mind worked on the larger problem of how to live in a house that felt like a held breath. 3 weeks into her residence, a carriage arrived unannounced. From it emerged a small, fierce woman of 70, with white hair, sharp blue eyes, and the bearing of a general. "So you are the one," the woman said, looking Lydia up and down in the entrance hall. "I am Millicent, the Dowager Duchess. I am his mother, and I have come to see whether you are worth the trouble." Rise appeared from his study looking, for the first time in Lydia's experience, something other than composed. He looked alarmed. "Mother, you were not expected." "I am never expected," Millicent replied. "That is what makes me effective. Now leave us. I wish to interrogate your wife." In the drawing room, Millicent settled into a chair and fixed Lydia with a stare that could have stripped paint. "Tell me, why did my son marry you? And do not give me that nonsense about requiring a duchess. He could have gone another 20 years without one, and been perfectly content in his misery." Lydia considered her answer. "He said I did not pretend." "Ha!" Millicent's mouth twitched. He would find that romantic in his way. "The truth, my dear, is that he saw a woman who had survived something without letting it make her hard. That is rarer than you think." She leaned forward. "This house has a wound, Lydia. My younger son, Nathaniel, died 7 years ago. A riding accident on the moors. Reese was with him. He blames himself, though the horse threw Nathaniel through no fault of anyone living. He has spent 7 years punishing himself with silence, and this house has been his prison. He thinks he wants quiet. What he needs is someone brave enough to sit with him inside it." Lydia looked at this woman and understood, with a sharp and immediate clarity, the shape of the problem she had married into. "I am not brave," Lydia said honestly, "but I am patient." "Patience is the bravery of quiet women," Millicent said. "It will do." Millicent stayed a fortnight and changed the weather of the house. She forced conversation at meals, demanded walks in the overgrown gardens, and extracted stories from her son that Lydia filed away like pressed flowers. Fragments of a life before the silence. She learned that the West Wing had once been a music room. She learned that Nathaniel had kept 3 dogs and a tame raven. She learned that Rhys had once laughed, though this seemed as distant and improbable as a rumor about another country. After Millicent left, the silence returned. But it was a different silence, less like a wall, more like a room, with the door left slightly open. Their evenings in the library became a ritual. He would read in his chair. She would read in hers. They did not speak, but they breathed the same air, sat in the same firelight. Slowly, over weeks, the distance between their chairs decreased. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be remarked upon, but perceptibly. She was learning the vocabulary of his restraint. A slight turning of his head meant he was listening. A pause before standing meant he did not want to leave. The tightening of his jaw meant something had touched a wound he refused to examine. One evening he looked up from his book and said, without preamble, You have put the botanical collection back in order. I found it behind the agricultural reports. It seemed misplaced. My brother catalogued it. A pause. He had an eye for that sort of thing. It was the first time he had mentioned Nathaniel to her directly. The name hung in the air like a note struck on a glass. He did excellent work, Lydia said simply. The indexing is meticulous. Rees looked at her for a long moment, then returned to his book, but something had unlocked, however slightly. She could feel it. A month later, a letter arrived from Honoria announcing her intention to visit. She would bring both children and stay a fortnight. She felt Lydia must be perishing of boredom and required the comfort of family. Lydia read the letter aloud at breakfast. Rees set down his coffee cup. "And when does your sister propose to descend upon us?" "Next Thursday." "I see." His jaw tightened in that way she had come to recognize. "Mrs. Burnett will prepare the guest rooms. But understand this, Lydia. This is your home. You are not her servant any longer." He had used her name. "Not Duchess. Not Miss Staverton. Lydia." The word, spoken in his low, careful voice, landed between them with the weight of something far larger than 2 syllables. Honoria arrived like a weather system. She swept through Thorn Hollow with the energy of someone determined to find fault, and thus skill to find it everywhere. "Goodness, it is gloomy," she said, peering up at the vaulted ceilings. "Like living inside a church. Do you not go mad, Lydia?" Her children, George, 12, and Daphne, 9, immediately began running through the halls, their shouts echoing off centuries of stone. Honoria made no effort to restrain them. For 3 days, Lydia felt herself sliding back into the old grooves. Honoria issued requests that were orders. "Lydia, be a dear and take the children for their walk. I have a headache. Lydia, do ask cook to change the soup. You know how I detest parsnip. Lydia, Daphne's ribbon has come undone. You are so much cleverer with your fingers than I am." On the 3rd evening, they were gathered in the drawing-room after dinner. Honoria was complaining about the distance to the nearest town. "One cannot even get a decent ribbon out here." "Lydia, you must write to London for me. You have nothing else pressing, I am sure." She turned to her daughter. "Daphne, go and ask your Aunt Lydia to mend that tear in your pinafore. She has always been so useful with a needle." Before Lydia could draw breath, Rees spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It filled the room the way cold fills an empty house, completely, without effort. "Daphne," he said, his gaze resting on the girl with a directness that made her go still. "Your aunt is the Duchess of Ashenmere. She is not a seamstress. If your pinafore requires mending, you will ring for one of the maids whose occupation it is." He turned to Honoria. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "And in future, Mrs. Firth, you will address my wife by her title, or, should she permit it, by her name. You will not call her dear as though she were a lapdog. You will not issue her instructions as though she were in your employ. She is not your convenience. She is my wife and the mistress of this house. I trust I have made myself understood." The silence that followed was so absolute that Lydia could hear the fire popping. Honoria's face went through several shades of red. I meant no offense, Your Grace. We are simply very close, Lydia and I. Then you will have no difficulty showing her the respect that closeness demands." He rose. "Lydia, shall we take our chess game in the library?" Lydia stood. Her legs were unsteady, but her voice was not. "Yes, I should like that." She walked from the room beside him, and for the first time in her life, she did not look back at her sister. In the library, he set up the chessboard without comment. They played in silence, but the air between them was altered, charged with something that had no name yet, but was unmistakably alive. "Thank you," she said, moving her bishop. He did not pretend to misunderstand. She had no right. You will not be diminished in your own home. He looked at her across the board, and his dark eyes held something she had not seen in them before. It was not warmth, not yet. It was fiercer than that. It was the look of a man who had drawn a line and would defend it. Honoria left 2 days early. The house exhaled. Autumn came to the moors in shades of amber and iron. The days shortened. The wind off the North Sea grew teeth. Lydia and Rhys settled into a rhythm that felt for the first time like partnership. He consulted her on estate matters. She managed the household accounts with a precision that earned Mrs. Burnett's grudging respect. They walked the grounds together in the afternoons, and he told her about the land. Which tenant needed a new roof, which field was lying fallow, where the river flooded in spring. He was teaching her his world, and she was learning it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, but one door remained closed. At the end of the east corridor, a room stayed locked. She knew what was behind it. She did not ask. The storm came in late October, a 3-day assault from the sea that turned the sky to black felt, and the moors to a howling wilderness. On the second night, the wind screamed in the chimneys, and the rain hammered the library windows like fists. Rhys could not sit still. He paced the length of the room, sprang at the window, staring out into the darkness, resuming his circuit. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one she could see building behind his eyes. He stopped in front of her chair. His face was stripped bare. "It was a day like this," he said. She closed her book. She did not speak. Nathaniel loved the moors in bad weather, he said. The wind made him feel alive. His voice was rough, as though the words were being torn out of him from somewhere deep. He took his horse out. I told him it was reckless. The ground was wet. The visibility was poor. But he laughed and said I worried like an old woman. He moved to the fireplace and gripped the mantel with both hands, his knuckles white. I went after him. I saddled my own horse and rode out, because I knew something was wrong. I felt it. I found him at the bottom of Crag Fell. The horse had stumbled on the wet scree. Nathaniel was on the ground. His neck, he stopped, drew a shaking breath. He was still breathing when I reached him. He looked at me. He tried to say something, and then he was gone. The fire crackled. The storm raged. Rhys stood with his back to her, his shoulders shaking with the effort of containment. I should have stopped him. I was his older brother. I was the Duke. I was the Duke. I should have locked the bloody stable door and let him rage at me. He would have been angry for a day. He would have been alive. The guilt, 7 years of it, compressed into a diamond of self-punishment, so hard it had crushed everything else inside him. Lydia rose from her chair. She crossed the room and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood there, close enough that he could feel her presence, steady and unmoving. "Rise," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She felt him flinch. "You said he loved the wind. You said it made him feel alive. Could you have taken that from him? Could you have locked the door every time the wind blew?" He turned his head. His eyes were wet. "You followed him," she continued, her voice soft and certain. "You rode into the storm because you loved him. You were there when he fell. You were there when he left. You did not let him die alone on those moors. You gave him that." The last thing he saw was his brother's face. "Do you truly believe he would have wanted you to spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for loving him enough to let him be who he was?" He stared at her. The dam he had built, stone by stone over 7 years, began to crack. A single tear fell, tracing a line down his sharp cheekbone. He did not wipe it away. "It was not your fault," Lydia said. "It was the rain and the scree and the terrible mathematics of chance. And you have paid a debt you never owed for 7 years. That is long enough." He let out a sound. Not a sob, not quite, but something close. The sound of a man setting down a weight he had carried. So long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Slowly, with a hesitation that spoke of years of self-imposed exile from human contact, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were cold. His grip was desperate. He held on as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid beneath him. They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand before the fire, while the storm spent itself against the ancient walls of Thorn Hollow. She did not speak. He did not need her to. She was there. That was enough. The storm broke before dawn. When Lydia came down to breakfast, the world outside the windows was washed clean, the moors gleaming under pale autumn sunlight. Res was already at the table. He looked different. The deep grooves of strain around his mouth had eased. He was not smiling. She suspected he had forgotten how, but the terrible tension that had held him rigid since the day she met him had loosened. "Good morning, Lydia," he said, and his voice was warmer than she had ever heard it. After breakfast, he took her upstairs, down the east corridor, to the locked door. He produced a key, turned it, and pushed the door open. The room was a young man's bedroom, preserved in amber. Riding boots in the corner, a stack of sketchbooks on the desk. On the wall above the bed, a watercolor of the moors in summer, wild grasses, purple heather, an enormous sky. In the corner of the painting, 2 figures on horseback, tiny against the vastness of the landscape, brothers riding together. "I want to move this to the main gallery," Rhys said quietly, "and these sketches," he was talented, "they deserve to be seen." He turned to face her. "I would like to open this wing. There is room here for something new." He paused, and she saw the effort it cost him. "I did not marry you expecting this. I married you expecting silence and order, and a sensible arrangement. But you have," he searched for the word, "you have not filled the silence, Lydia. You have changed what it means. It used to be an absence. Now it feels like a room with someone in it." He took both her hands. "I made a contract for a duchess," he said. "What I found was something I had stopped believing existed. You are not the quiet I asked for. You are the reason the quiet is no longer frightening." She looked up at him, at this severe, damaged, honorable man who had spent 7 years entombed in his own guilt, and felt something break open inside her chest, something warm and startling and entirely unexpected. She had stopped counting the years. She had stopped waiting. And in that surrender, she had stumbled into a love that was not the giddy romance of youth, but something stronger. The steady, deliberate choice of 2 people who had seen each other clearly and decided, with open eyes, that they belonged in the same room. "I was not looking for this," she said. "Nor was I," he replied, and then, for the first time, he smiled. A real smile. It was rusty and uncertain, as though the muscles had forgotten their purpose, but it reached his eyes and transformed his face from stone to something human and warm and achingly tender. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, and the gesture, so simple and so long in coming, felt like the first day of spring after an endless winter. 18 months later, the library at Thorn Hollow was unrecognizable. The dust was gone, the shelves were ordered, the fire burned bright in the hearth, and the tall windows stood open to the summer air, letting in the scent of heather and fresh-cut grass. Lydia sat in her chair, with a book she was not reading, because the scene before her was far more absorbing than any novel. Rhys was on the floor, the Duke of Ashenmere on the floor, with their 7-month-old daughter balanced on his knee. The baby had her mother's grey-green eyes and her father's dark hair, and she was laughing with the pure, uncomplicated joy that only very small humans can produce. Rhys was making a face at her, a deeply undignified expression that would have scandalized every member of the ton, and the sound of his own laughter, rough, unpracticed, wonderful, filled the room. They had named her Nell. It was short for Nathaniel's middle name, a quiet memorial that Rhys had suggested one evening, his voice steady, his eyes clear. Millicent sat in the opposite chair, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision, watching her son with an expression that Lydia had never seen on her face before. It was not satisfaction, not pride, though both were present. It was relief. The bone-deep relief of a mother who had spent 7 years watching her child drown and was finally seeing him breathe. "I did not think I would live to see this," Millicent said quietly. "Nor did I," Lydia replied. A letter from Honoria lay on the table, opened and read. Her sister's correspondence had changed over the past year. The condescension had faded, replaced by something that might, with time, become genuine respect. Her last letter had asked Lydia's advice on a school for Daphne. It was a small thing, but it marked the final inversion of a hierarchy that had stood for 15 years. Rhys looked up from the floor, the baby clutching his finger with fierce determination, and met Lydia's eyes. His smile, still rare, still slightly awkward, but real, was for her alone. It said everything that his years of silence had tried to bury, that he was grateful, that he was present, that he loved her, not with the reckless fire of youth, but with the steady, enduring heat of a man who had chosen to come back to life. Lydia smiled back. Her hand rested on the gentle curve of her stomach, where their second child was growing. A secret she had not yet told him, though she suspected Millicent already knew. The house was no longer silent. It was full of the sounds that silence, properly tended, eventually becomes: laughter and footsteps, and the small, ordinary noises of a family learning, day by day, how to be happy. She had stopped counting the years. She had stopped waiting, and in the space that waiting had left behind, she had built, with patience and quiet courage and a love she had never expected, a life that was entirely and unmistakably her own.